The morning Ethan Walker spent the last of his savings on 6 rusted machines that hadn't moved in over a decade. A man standing nearby pulled out his phone and took a picture, not because it was a proud moment to capture, but because he wanted proof of just how far a person could fall. The image made its way around the local diner, passed between coffee cups and raised eyebrows, met with low whistles and slow shakes of the head. By nightfall, half the county had heard about it. By the following weekend, Ethan Walker had become the town's favorite cautionary tale, the former engineer who cracked under pressure, blew his last dollar on scrap metal, and sealed his own fate in front of witnesses. But the thing about a cautionary tale is that it only holds its shape when the ending is already written. And no one in that town had any idea how the ending was going to go. Ethan was 42 years old, and he had the kind of face that had earned its lines honestly. He'd spent his 20s working his way through an agricultural engineering degree at a state university, the kind of school where you paid for your education with weekend labor and early mornings, not tuition funds quietly transferred from a family account. He graduated with honors, took a position with a mid-sized agribusiness firm, and spent the better part of a decade doing exactly what people expected of him: designing irrigation systems, optimizing crop layouts, consulting on mechanical efficiency for farms that stretched across hundreds of acres. He was good at his work, better than good. His supervisor at the firm used to say that Ethan had a rare gift for seeing the relationship between soil and machine, between what land needed and what equipment could give it. In a field where most people thought in terms of what the technology dictated, Ethan thought in terms of what the land was asking for. It was a subtle difference, but it mattered enormously. Then the marriage ended. It didn't end dramatically. There was no single catastrophic event, no betrayal, no screaming argument that shattered everything at once. It ended the way most things end, when two people grow in different directions without ever acknowledging it slowly. Then all at once, like a long drought that finally takes the last tree, the divorce papers were signed on a Tuesday. By Thursday, Ethan had packed what fit in a truck and driven back to the county where he'd grown up, a wide, flat stretch of central land that smelled like turned earth in spring and diesel in harvest season. He had no clear plan. He had a toolbox, a reputation for being able to fix almost anything with an engine, and a quiet, private understanding that he needed to start over somewhere that felt like ground beneath his feet. He found work quickly enough, because in farm country, a man who could diagnose a failing hydraulic system or rebuild a seized engine was never unemployed for long. He moved from farm to farm, picking up jobs as they came, charging fair rates, keeping to himself. He lived in a small house on the edge of town. The kind of house where the gutters needed work and the porch sagged slightly on one side, but where the kitchen was warm and the rent was manageable. Most mornings he was out before sunrise. Most nights he came home carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who works with his body but thinks with something deeper. He cooked simple meals, read technical journals and soil science papers, and made careful notes in a series of notebooks that stacked up on the kitchen shelf beside a small collection of agricultural engineering textbooks he'd never been able to sell. His neighbors found him polite but distant. The town, in the way that small towns tend to do, had already decided who he was: a man who'd had his shot and missed it, who'd come home to coast out whatever years were left. The narrative was neat, and people liked neat narratives. They asked no further questions. Logan Pierce was everything Ethan was not, at least on the surface. He was the third generation of his family to work the land in that county, and the first to have turned farming into something that resembled a small empire. He owned just under 4,000 acres, employed a rotating staff of 60 people at peak season, and had his name on the donor plaques of 3 local institutions. He drove a truck that cost more than most of the houses on Ethan's street. He was not a cruel man in any calculated way, but he had grown up being told that certain things were true about the world, that success was a proof of character, that failure was a personal failing, and that a man who couldn't hold his life together by 40 probably never would. When Ethan showed up in his county and started doing contract repair work for farmers who couldn't afford Logan's preferred vendors, Logan noticed. And when he noticed something that didn't fit his understanding of the way things should be, He had a habit of making sure everyone else noticed it too. His comments about Ethan were never vicious, but they were consistent. And in a town where Logan's opinion carried weight, consistency was enough. It was a Tuesday in late October when Ethan saw the notice in the county legal paper, a bankrupt in the auction for a farm equipment operation that had folded 6 months earlier. The listed inventory was mostly unremarkable. The kinds of items that get swallowed up quickly by neighboring operations looking for parts and attachments. But buried in the middle of the itemized list, described in the sparse language of legal inventory, were 6 tractor units, model designation and serial numbers included. Condition listed simply as non-operational. Ethan read those serial numbers twice. Then he got up from his kitchen table, opened one of the engineering textbooks on the shelf, and cross-referenced something he had been thinking about for the better part of 3 years. He sat back down. He read the serial numbers again. Then he closed the book, folded the newspaper, and spent the next 4 days doing the most thorough mechanical research he had done since graduate school. What Ethan had recognized in those serial numbers was something that would have meant nothing to anyone outside a narrow slice of agricultural engineering history. The 6 tractors listed in that auction had been built as part of a small-run prototype series by a manufacturer that had gone out of business in the early 2000s. Machines designed for an experimental, heavy-duty precision farming application that had never been commercially developed. The frames were constructed from a steel alloy specification that most manufacturers had abandoned because the cost was too high for standard production. The hydraulic architecture in these units had been designed with a modularity that standard farm equipment simply did not have. The engines were seized, the bodywork was consumed by rust, and on the surface they were exactly what Logan Pierce would later call them: 6 piles of junk sitting in a field. But Ethan had spent 3 years quietly developing a theoretical framework for an automated soil management system. And in those 6 frames, he saw not tractors, but platforms. Not machines to buy, but infrastructure to build from. He went to the auction with a number in his head. And he left having spent every dollar he had saved in 2 years of contract work. The auction itself was a modest affair, held on a gray weekday morning with a county auctioneer and a small crowd of practical men in work boots who had come to pick up useful things. Ethan stood near the back, drank bitter coffee from a paper cup, and waited. The useful things sold quickly. When the 6 rusted units came up, there was a brief, collective pause. The kind of pause that happens when something appears on an auction block, and the crowd collectively decides it isn't worth the effort of raising a hand. The auctioneer dropped the opening price twice. Still nothing. Ethan raised his hand. The gavel came down. He was the only bidder. It should have been a quiet, unremarkable transaction. It wasn't, because Logan Pierce had come to the auction that morning on the recommendation of his equipment manager, and when he saw what Ethan had just bought, he laughed out loud, the full, unguarded laugh of a man who finds something genuinely absurd. Several people around him smiled. A few laughed too. Someone said something about 6 monuments to poor judgment. Ethan paid, signed the paperwork, and arranged for the machines to be loaded and hauled to the 12 acres of dry, unplanted land he had quietly purchased the previous spring, at a price so low it had been barely worth listing. The land Ethan had bought was the kind that more experienced buyers had passed over for reasons that seemed obvious. It sat at the low end of a slight geological slope, which meant it collected the runoff from 3 neighboring properties during heavy rains and baked hard in dry seasons. The soil profile was inconsistent, shifting from clay-heavy to sandy within the span of a few hundred feet. There was no existing infrastructure, no irrigation, no structures, no utilities beyond a single-phase power connection at the property line. When Ethan brought his 6 rusted machines to that land and began unloading them in the fading light of a November afternoon, the image had a particular kind of desolation to it. He stood in the middle of 12 acres of hard ground, with 6 broken tractors and a set of notebooks full of calculations, and whatever doubt lived in him, he kept it to himself. He began the work methodically, the way he had learned to approach every complex mechanical challenge, starting with the most thorough possible inventory of what he had before deciding what to do with it. He spent the first 2 weeks doing nothing but disassembly and documentation. taking apart each of the 6 units component by component, cataloging every part, assessing every subsystem. What he found confirmed what his research had suggested. The frames were structurally sound. Beneath the rust, the alloy had held its integrity in ways that ordinary steel would not have. The hydraulic systems were corroded but architecturally intact. 2 of the 6 engines were salvageable, with complete rebuilds. The other 4 would need to be replaced, but the mounting architecture was compatible with a range of available power plants. And the electronic control infrastructure, the wiring harnesses and sensor mounting points that these units had been built with as part of their prototype specification, were exactly the foundation he needed. What Ethan was building was not, in any meaningful sense, a conventional farm. He was designing an integrated system, a network of automated soil management machinery that could read the land it was working and respond in real time, adjusting depth, pressure, moisture inputs, and nutrient delivery based on continuous sensor feedback rather than fixed schedules. The concept was not new in agricultural engineering circles. Precision farming had been a growing field for decades, but what Ethan had worked out in those notebooks, across 3 years of evenings and weekends, was a way to do it at a fraction of the cost that any existing system required, using rebuilt mechanical platforms rather than purpose-built automated units, running custom software he was writing himself on open-source architecture, and integrating everything through a sensor network built primarily from off-the-shelf industrial components reconfigured for agricultural application. It was, in engineering terms, extraordinarily clever. It was also, from the outside, completely invisible. What people saw when they drove past his land was a man alone, working on old machines in a field. He worked through the winter with a diesel heater in a temporary structure he built over the first unit he was rebuilding. He worked through spring planting season while the farms around him were in full operational swing, and he was still calibrating sensor arrays and testing hydraulic pressure tolerances. His hands were perpetually cracked from the cold and the work, and he developed the particular economy of movement that comes from spending many hours in confined mechanical spaces. He ate most meals standing at his workbench. He slept when he needed to and woke without an alarm. There were mornings when he drove past the fields of neighboring farms, already green and organized, already producing, and felt the specific weight of being behind, not behind schedule, because there was no external schedule to answer to, but behind in the way that a person feels when the world seems to be moving at a pace they cannot match. He didn't linger on it. He went back to the work. The first real test of the season was brutal. A drought moved into the region in late June, the kind that settled in without announcement and simply refused to lift. The surrounding farms suffered. Logan Pierce's operation, vast and well capitalized, managed its losses through sheer scale. He could afford to absorb a bad year in ways that smaller operators could not. Several of the farms Ethan had been doing contract work for lost significant portions of their crops and quietly stopped calling him for jobs. His own first planting, a modest trial of 3 crop varieties on less than half his land, came under severe stress. The automated moisture management system he had built was working, but it was working against conditions it had not been fully calibrated for, and there were 3 weeks in July when Ethan made manual adjustments to the system every single day, essentially feeding his own observational data back into the model in real time, learning and correcting simultaneously. He lost some of what he planted, but he lost less than the neighboring farms lost, significantly less, by a margin that his own records documented precisely, even though no one was asking to see those records. The money situation was also deteriorating. He had exhausted his savings on the tractors and the land, and the income from contract work had slowed with the drought. He applied for a business development loan from the Regional Agricultural Lending Office, submitting what he believed was a thorough technical proposal. The loan officer was polite and genuinely tried to understand what Ethan was describing, but the proposal fell outside every category the lending criteria were built around. There were no precedents to evaluate it against. The technology was too experimental, the commercial model too unproven, the applicant too isolated. The loan was declined. Ethan revised the proposal and applied to 2 other institutions. Both declined. He sold his truck and bought an older, cheaper one. He reduced his food budget to the absolute minimum, and started selling small amounts of what he'd managed to grow at the local farmer's market, less for the income than to establish that the land was producing something. The farmers at the market were friendly to him. They did not fully understand what he was doing, but they knew a man who worked hard when they saw one. The second year was different in ways that mattered. His system was fully calibrated now the winter, and the drought had given him data he wouldn't have had otherwise, and he had incorporated it all. He expanded his planting to the full 12 acres, running 4 different crop trials simultaneously, each managed through the automated system with slightly different parameter sets. The spring rains came in properly, and for the first time, he watched his land respond the way his models had predicted it would. The soil management system was doing what it was designed to do, reading the moisture content and compaction levels across different zones of the field and adjusting the machinery passes accordingly, delivering water with a precision that a conventional irrigation setup simply could not achieve without significantly more infrastructure. His yields at the end of that second growing season were not exceptional by the standards of well-managed conventional farms with good soil, but his input costs were a fraction of what those farms spent, and the consistency of output across different zones of his difficult, variable land was something that an agricultural data analyst would have found remarkable. He did not know that an agricultural data analyst was, in fact, finding it remarkable. A venture-backed agricultural technology fund based several states away had set up an automated monitoring system that scraped publicly available water usage records, equipment registration data, and commodity production filings from rural counties across the region, flagging statistical anomalies for human review. The metrics from Ethan's 12 acres had triggered a flag 18 months earlier, when his first-year water usage numbers had come in significantly below what any comparable operation in the same drought conditions had reported. The flag had sat in a review queue. By the time the second-year numbers were added to the file, someone at the fund had looked at it and found the combination of data points sufficiently unusual to pass up the chain. Logan, meanwhile, had been quietly acquiring parcels of land that bordered Ethan's property on 2 sides, at prices that were fair enough not to constitute overt pressure, but strategically chosen in a way that limited Ethan's options for future expansion. He had mentioned to a few people that he was simply doing what any sensible businessman would do when adjacent land became available. Most people agreed that made sense. Victoria Hayes did not operate on consensus. She had built her reputation and her company on a specific and frequently validated belief that the most significant innovations in agricultural technology over the next 2 decades would not come from the major research institutions or the established equipment manufacturers, but from practitioners working at the intersection of traditional soil knowledge and unconventional engineering. Her firm, Greenfield Systems, had made 11 investments in the previous 4 years, 9 of which had produced above-market returns. 2 of the 11 had become transformative platform companies. She was 48 years old, had a doctorate in agricultural systems from a research university, and an MBA she considered marginally useful, and had a professional reputation for being willing to go somewhere inconvenient and look at something uncomfortable if the data suggested she should. Her executive team had learned, over years of working with her, that the phrase "it's probably nothing" tended to make her more interested, not less. The report that reached Victoria's desk in March of the following year had been written by a junior analyst who prefaced it with the observation that the subject was, most likely, a small operator who had gotten lucky with a novel approach that probably would not scale. Victoria read the report twice, then looked at the data appendix for a long time. The efficiency ratios were not the product of luck. The consistency across multiple growing seasons and across highly variable soil conditions within a single property was a statistical signature that luck did not produce. And the water usage figures, cross-referenced against the regional drought records, suggested a level of precision in moisture management that went well beyond anything she was familiar with in small-scale operations. She sent the report back to the analyst with 2 words written at the top in her characteristic compressed handwriting: dig deeper. 3 weeks later, when a more thorough follow-up arrived on her desk, she read it in one sitting, set it down, and told her assistant to arrange transportation. Her executive team raised the expected objections. She listened, acknowledged them, and went anyway. The helicopter set down on a cleared section of Ethan's property on a Thursday morning in early May. Victoria stepped out alone. Having told her team that she preferred to do initial site assessments without an entourage, a preference they had learned not to argue with. Ethan was working near the equipment shed when he heard the rotors, and he stood watching the aircraft land with the expression of a man who has been surprised but is too tired to show it dramatically. Victoria walked toward him across the field, wearing boots that had seen actual fieldwork, and introduced herself with the directness of someone who considers pleasantries an inefficiency. Ethan shook her hand. He did not appear particularly impressed or particularly intimidated. He appeared to be waiting to find out what she wanted. What Victoria had expected, based on the data, was a sophisticated operation, multiple buildings, a full technical staff, expensive sensor infrastructure, the visible markers of a well-funded technology project. What she found was 12 acres of well-organized land, a modest equipment structure, and 6 modified tractors that looked, on initial inspection, like machines that had been assembled by someone working from a parts catalog that didn't officially exist. She walked the entire property with Ethan over 2 hours, asking questions that were technically specific and listening to the answers with the focused attention of a person who is genuinely trying to understand something. Ethan answered everything directly, without embellishment. He showed her the sensor network, explained the control architecture, walked her through the data logs from the previous 2 growing seasons. At no point did he try to sell her anything. He spoke about his system, the way a person speaks about something they built, because they needed it to exist with the specific clarity of someone who has thought about nothing else for a very long time. By the time they got back to the equipment shed, Victoria had understood 3 things clearly. First, that the data she had been given was not an anomaly or an accident. It was the product of a genuinely novel technical approach that worked. Second, that the approach could theoretically be scaled, that the core architecture Ethan had developed was not dependent on his specific land or his specific conditions, but was a generalizable framework that could be adapted across a wide range of farming environments. And third, that this man standing in front of her, in worn work clothes with hydraulic fluid on his hands, had accomplished something in relative isolation and on a shoestring budget that multiple well-funded agricultural technology companies had been trying and failing to do for years. She told him so plainly. She said she wanted to talk about a partnership. She described what Greenfield Systems could bring to the table: capital, scaling infrastructure, distribution networks, a team of engineers who could help develop what he had built into something deployable at national scale. It was, by any objective measure, a remarkable offer. Ethan listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he said no. The word landed in the warm air of the equipment shed and seemed to take a moment to register. Victoria had not often heard that word in a professional context, and the couple of times it had happened, the conditions had been radically different from these. She was not accustomed to being refused. She was, by any reasonable measure, offering exactly the thing that most people in Ethan's position would have spent years trying to obtain. She asked him, calmly, to explain. He did, in the same direct way he had answered everything else. He said that he had spent 7 years building something that was entirely his thinking, his work, his solutions to problems he had defined himself. He said that he had watched what happened when small innovators sold their core technology to large organizations too early, and that he had no interest in spending the next chapter of his life working on someone else's version of his own idea. He said he was willing to consider a conversation about a different kind of arrangement at some point when he understood what that arrangement would actually mean for the integrity of what he had built. He said he'd like to keep thinking. Victoria thanked him for his time, walked back to her helicopter, and flew home. What happened next was not something Ethan had planned or anticipated. Someone on Victoria's team, in the process of preparing background documentation for the site visit, had filed for a routine public records inquiry on the property. A local reporter doing a slow Newsweek scan of county filings had noticed the inquiry, had connected it to the name of Greenfield Systems, and had made a few calls. Within a week, a short piece appeared in a regional agricultural trade publication, describing the visit of a major agtech investor to an unconventional small operation in the county. The piece was careful and factual, but it named Ethan, it named Victoria. It described Greenfield Systems' track record, and it noted that the visit had apparently not resulted in an agreement. In the world of agricultural investment, where people followed the movements of established players carefully, that last detail was the most interesting. The question of why a company with Victoria Hayes's record would make a personal site visit and then walk away without a deal generated precisely the kind of speculation that drives up perceived value. 3 separate investment contacts reached out to Ethan within the following 10 days. None of them got a meeting. 2 smaller technology consultancies wrote public commentary suggesting the technology Ethan was working with might represent a significant advance in precision farming economics. The value of the narrative, if not the underlying asset itself, was compounding in ways that Ethan had neither sought nor particularly desired. Logan Pierce read the trade publication piece on a Sunday morning over breakfast and read it a second time before putting his phone down. He had known, in the vague way that a person knows something they prefer not to examine closely, that the man he had written off years ago had been doing something out there on those 12 acres. He had heard the farmers' market talk, had noted the reduced contract work, had assumed, without looking too carefully, that Ethan was just surviving, the way people do when they don't have other options. The idea that a person like Victoria Hayes had flown in on a helicopter specifically to look at what Ethan had built, that was a recalibration that Logan found uncomfortable. He didn't say much about it publicly. He had learned enough, over the years, to understand that making yourself the loudest voice in a story you don't yet understand is rarely wise. Victoria came back. She came back 6 weeks after the first visit. And this time, she brought her chief technical officer and her head of business development. They spent 2 full days at the property, going through the system documentation in detail, running independent analysis of the sensor network data, testing the control software against scenarios Ethan hadn't actually deployed yet to see how the model extrapolated. The technical team was, by the second day, openly enthusiastic in the way that engineers get when they encounter something that is both novel and rigorous, a combination that is rarer than most people in the industry like to admit. Victoria met with Ethan each evening after the technical work was done, and they talked about the technology, about the philosophy behind it, about what scaling it would actually require, and what it would mean for it to work across different kinds of land in different parts of the country. These were, for the first time, conversations between equals, and both of them seemed to recognize that. On the third morning, Victoria put a number on the table. $100 million. Structured as an acquisition of a 51% stake in the technology and its associated patents, with a long-term operational agreement that would keep Ethan as the lead technical director of the expanded program and give him meaningful constraints on how the technology was deployed. The number was serious. The structure was not a buyout. It was a partnership with Ethan in a position of real authority. She had had her legal team draft the framework specifically to address the concerns he had raised in their first meeting. She slid the term sheet across the work table in the equipment shed and waited. Ethan read through the entire document before he said anything. He asked 4 specific questions about governance clauses and deployment authorization. He took the document home that evening and spent the night reviewing it. The following morning he called his attorney, a woman he'd worked with on the original land purchase, and asked her to look at it. She called him back 4 hours later, and the tone of her voice when she said the words, "This is a legitimate offer," told him something about how the previous years must have looked from the outside. He signed 2 days later, at the work table in the equipment shed, where Victoria had first put the document down, with her chief of staff and his attorney as witnesses, and the legal team on a video call from 3 different cities. The news did not stay local for long. The combination of the deal size, the technology's potential implications, and the story of how it had been built alone, on problematic land, with rebuilt equipment, was the kind of narrative that the agricultural and business press handled with enthusiasm. By the end of the week, Ethan's name was in publications that covered agricultural innovation at a national level. Photographers came to the farm. A documentary production company sent an inquiry. A university agricultural engineering department asked if he would consider a visiting lecture position. The town where he had been the cautionary tale became, within the span of about 10 days, the hometown of a locally grown success story that people were eager to claim a connection to. The day the formal signing ceremony was held at the property, a formal event with attorneys, representatives from Greenfield Systems, and a collection of journalists who had been invited at Victoria's insistence that the announcement be made on site, was the day the full weight of what had happened settled over the county like something atmospheric. Victoria's helicopter landed in the same spot it had landed before, but this time there were vehicles already parked along the property access road, and a small crowd had gathered at a respectful distance. Logan Pierce was among them, not because he had been invited, but because the thing was happening in his county, and he had the particular need of a man who wants to see the evidence for himself. He stood near the back of the gathering with his hands in his pockets, and watched as attorneys opened briefcases and documents were spread across a folding table set up in front of the equipment shed. He watched as Victoria Hayes and Ethan Walker signed their names, and as the people assembled, made the sounds that people make when something becomes official. The 6 rusted tractors stood at the edge of the frame. Ethan had cleaned and organized them for the first time since they'd arrived, and someone had taken a photograph of them that would, in the weeks that followed, appear in several publications accompanying the story of how they'd been bought and what they'd eventually made possible. They looked, in the photos, like deliberate artifacts which, in a way, they had become. The weeks after the signing were not triumphant in the way that Ethan had imagined triumph might feel, back in the years when he had thought about it at all. He was busy. There were meetings, technical briefings, introductions to engineers who would be joining the expanded program, calls with lawyers about patent filings, conversations with Victoria about deployment timelines. The farm itself continued to operate, because the crops didn't pause for paperwork, and Ethan still walked his fields every morning before anything else, still checked his sensors and reviewed his overnight data, still did the work the way he had done it when no one was watching. If he felt the satisfaction of having been right about something for a long time, he kept that mostly to himself. Logan Pierce found him on the property one morning about 3 weeks after the signing, walking the fence line near the equipment shed. Logan had driven over without calling ahead, which was the kind of thing that people in farm country sometimes did, and which Ethan accepted without comment. They walked for a few minutes without saying much. Logan eventually said that he had been thinking, and that if there was any opportunity, any role, any arrangement in which his land and his operation might be part of what Ethan was building, he would appreciate the chance to have that conversation. He said it without his usual ease, in the slightly halting way of a man who is making himself say something that costs him something. Ethan didn't make it harder than it needed to be. He said he would think about it, and that he'd have someone from his team reach out. Then, as they were standing at the edge of the field with the morning light cutting long shadows across the turned earth, Ethan said something that Logan would later describe, in the careful way of someone quoting from memory, that he had not become what he had become because of anyone's doubt that he had become it because he had never once doubted himself. Not on the days when the machines wouldn't start, not on the days the bank said no, not on the days when the only person who believed in what he was building was the person building it. He said it without heat, the way a person states something that has been true for a long time and no longer needs to be argued. Logan nodded slowly. He did not say much in response. He drove away without looking back. The technology that Ethan Walker had developed from 6 rusted machines on 12 difficult acres would, in the 3 years following the Greenfield Systems partnership, be deployed across pilot programs in 7 states, in farming environments ranging from the high plains wheat belt to the humid lowlands of the Mid-South. The cost-efficiency results consistently matched or exceeded what the original 12-acre data had suggested. The water usage reductions alone, across the scale of the pilot programs, generated the kind of numbers that attracted the attention of federal agricultural policy offices and at least 2 major conservation foundations. Victoria Hayes became a frequent presence at the farm, not just for business, but in the way that people who have found genuine respect for a place return to it because the place holds something they don't often encounter. She and Ethan did not agree on everything, but they agreed on the things that mattered. And the things that mattered were the things that had been written in those notebooks long before she had ever heard his name. The 6 tractors were never restored to operational condition. They were cleaned, documented, and placed in a permanent covered structure at the edge of the property that a reporter once described as somewhere between a museum display and a monument. They had not, in the end, been what Ethan used them for. They had been something else, entirely not machines to operate the land, but materials from which to think about it differently. The frames that other people had seen as junk had been, in Ethan's understanding, the most precisely suited building blocks available for a system that no one else had conceived of yet. There was a lesson in that. Though Ethan was not the kind of person who went around framing lessons for other people, he had learned what he needed to learn, at the cost that learning always actually carries, and he had done the work that the learning pointed toward. The rest was commentary. There is a particular kind of intelligence that does not show itself easily, that lives in the willingness to see past what is obvious to what is possible, and to hold that vision with enough patience and enough stubbornness to outlast the ridicule and the rejections and the quiet erosion of the years when nothing visible is happening. The town that had once held Ethan Walker up as evidence of what failure looked like would eventually hold him up as evidence of something else, and both uses of him said more about the town than about the man. He had not been the cautionary tale they needed him to be, and he had not become the inspiration they wanted to claim. He had been, through all of it, only what he had always been, a person who looked at something broken and saw what it could become, and who was willing to do the slow, unglamorous work of making that transformation real. Because sometimes the most valuable thing in the world is not what other people are willing to see. It is what one person, standing alone in a field of rust and hard ground and early morning quiet, refuses to stop believing is there. The patents filed in the months following the partnership covered 17 distinct technical innovations, each one documented with the kind of specificity that comes from years of iterative real-world refinement rather than laboratory hypothesis. The core of what Ethan had built was a dynamic response architecture, a control logic that treated each section of land as an independent variable rather than a uniform unit, and which adjusted all mechanized activity in response to what the sensors were reading in real time, not what a schedule dictated. This sounds, when described in plain language, like a straightforward idea, but the gap between a straightforward idea and a working system built from rebuilt machines and custom software on land that the local lending community had declined to invest in, that gap was the entire story, and it was measured in years, not months. The young engineers who joined the expanded team in the first year after the partnership were, several of them, recent graduates from the same kind of agricultural engineering programs that Ethan had attended 2 decades earlier. They arrived at the farm expecting, perhaps, a more polished operation offices with whiteboards, a proper server room, the infrastructure of a technology company. What they found was a working farm, managed by a man who still got up before dawn and walked his fields with the same attention he had brought to every morning for the previous 7 years. He brought them out on those walks in the first weeks, before the meetings and the documentation reviews and the technical onboarding. He wanted them to understand something before they understood the code or the mechanical systems. He wanted them to understand the relationship between observation and design, between what the land was actually doing and what the technology was supposed to serve. Several of those engineers would later describe those early morning walks as the most formative professional experiences of their careers. One of them, in an interview for an industry publication 3 years later, said that Ethan had taught her to listen to a field the way a doctor listens to a patient, not to confirm what you already think, but to find out what you don't yet know. Victoria understood this about him, and it was part of what had made her willing to structure the partnership as she had. She had worked with enough technology innovators to know the difference between someone who had built something clever and someone who had built something true, something grounded in a deep and genuine understanding of the problem it was solving. Clever things were scalable but brittle. True things were harder to scale, but endured. She had built her company's reputation on the ability to tell the difference, and Ethan Walker was, without question, the second kind. The pilot program in the High Plains wheat region was the first real test of whether the system could perform outside the specific conditions of the original 12 acres. The land there was fundamentally different, flatter, drier, with a different soil composition and a different set of weather variables to contend with. The local farming operations that had agreed to participate were cautious, as experienced operators tend to be when encountering something new, and the first season was as much about building trust with the operators as it was about proving out the technology. Ethan spent significant time in the region in those months, walking those fields the way he walked his own, asking questions and listening to the answers the way he had learned to do on his own land. By the end of the first growing season, the results were modest but directionally consistent with the model's predictions. By the end of the second season, 2 of the participating operations had significantly expanded their involvement, and word had spread to neighboring farms in the way that practical results spread in farm country quietly, through conversations between people who trust each other's assessments of what actually works. The Mid-South lowland pilot was more challenging. The humidity and precipitation patterns created a different set of moisture management problems, and the clay-heavy soils required significant recalibration of the compaction management algorithms. There was a difficult stretch in the second month when 3 of the deployed units were producing inconsistent sensor readings, and the remote technical team and Ethan worked through consecutive long nights to identify and correct the source of the error, a temperature-related drift in one component of the sensor calibration sequence that no one had anticipated because the original system had never operated in the slice conditions with that kind of thermal variation. The fix, once identified, was incorporated into the system architecture as a permanent improvement, and the data from those difficult weeks became part of the training set that made the overall model more robust. That was the nature of the work. Every failure was information, and information was the raw material of everything. There were evenings, in the years after the partnership, when Ethan would sit at the same kitchen table where he had first read those serial numbers in the county legal paper, and look at the stack of notebooks on the shelf that had started accumulating again, new notebooks now, full of the next set of problems he was working through, the next set of questions he was trying to answer. The original notebooks were still there, the ones from the early years, slightly warped from the moisture of unheated winter mornings, when he had worked through calculations before the heater caught up with the temperature. He did not look at them with nostalgia particularly. He looked at them the way you look at a road you have already traveled, with recognition, and with the particular clarity that comes from knowing how the terrain actually felt under your feet, not just how it appears on a map. His daughter called on Sunday mornings. She was 19 now, studying environmental science at a university several states away, and their conversations had the specific warmth of a relationship that had been maintained carefully across distance and across the disruptions of a difficult decade. She had visited the farm once before the partnership and once after, and both times she had worked alongside him for a full day without complaint, learning to read the sensor displays, asking questions about the control architecture that were more sophisticated than most adults would have managed. He was proud of her in the uncomplicated way of a parent who has watched a child become a person they genuinely admire. On the Sunday mornings when he sat at the kitchen table after the call ended, in the quiet that follows a good conversation with someone you love, he thought about what it meant to build something over a long time, not just the technology, but a life, a record of choices made under pressure and without certainty, a proof of something that could not have been demonstrated any faster than it had been demonstrated. Logan Pierce became a participant in the program in the second year after the partnership. His land, 4,000 acres of well-managed conventional operation, became one of the largest single deployments of the Ethan Walker system outside the original pilot regions. The results, across Logan's acreage, were significant enough to be documented as a featured case study in Greenfield Systems' annual investor report. Logan spoke about it publicly, in the measured way of a man who is acknowledging something that cost him something to acknowledge. And he did not attempt to rewrite the history of what he had said and done in the years before. He had been wrong about Ethan Walker, and the county knew it, and he lived with that knowledge the way that a person lives with a lesson that arrived late, with a certain permanent humility that looks, from the outside, like a different kind of person than he used to be. The afternoon that the documentary crew came to film at the property, part of a feature on agricultural innovation that would eventually be broadcast nationally, they asked Ethan if they could shoot him working. He agreed, and spent an hour doing exactly what he would have been doing anyway. Walking the field in the low afternoon light, checking a sensor cluster near the north boundary of the property, adjusting a calibration setting on one of the units. He did not perform for the camera. He did not speak in the rehearsed, polished way of someone who has been media trained. He spoke about the work the way he always spoke about it, directly, with the specific vocabulary of a person who has thought about almost nothing else for a very long time. When the director asked him what he would tell someone who was standing at the beginning of a long and uncertain undertaking, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said that he didn't think most people failed because they encountered obstacles. He thought most people failed because they eventually accepted someone else's assessment of what was possible, and that the hardest thing was not the work itself, but maintaining the clarity to see past what other people told you they could see, to what you knew was actually there. The director later said that those two sentences were the part of the footage she had been most certain she would use. Victoria, in the interview she gave for the same documentary, said that in 20 years of working in agricultural technology investment, she had never encountered a situation where the gap between how something appeared and what it actually was had been so extreme. She said that the 6 tractors, sitting cleaned and covered at the edge of the property, were probably the most useful way to think about what Ethan had done, not because they were dramatic, but because they were true. They were objects that an entire community had agreed were worthless, and the only thing that had made them something else was the fact that one person had looked at them differently and had been willing to stake everything on that different way of seeing. She said that was the kind of investment thesis she had spent her career trying to identify, and that she was aware of how lucky she had been to find it when she did. She paused, and then added that she wasn't sure luck was exactly the right word. The data had been there. She had simply been willing to follow it somewhere uncomfortable. That, she said, was the entire job. The county fair that fall had a display celebrating local achievement that included a photograph of Ethan's farm and a brief text panel describing the technology and the partnership. It was placed between a display honoring a local teacher who had retired after 30 years and a display about a high school sports team that had won a regional championship. It was, in its context, a modest and ordinary thing, the kind of local acknowledgement that happens in every county, every year, for every kind of accomplishment. But a few people who stood in front of it for a moment, in the crowded gymnasium where the fair displays were always held, thought about the story behind it, the auction, the laughing, the years of silence, the helicopter, and felt something that was harder to name than simple pride. Something closer to a reckoning. The understanding that the story of a place is not fixed until it is over, and that the people it will end up being about are not always the ones who seemed most likely at the beginning, because that is, finally, what this story is about, not money, and not technology, and not even the satisfying geometry of a man who was doubted and proved the doubters wrong. It is about the kind of vision that sustains itself in the absence of validation, that does not require the approval of a community or a bank or a competitor to remain intact, that is held in place not by stubbornness or bitterness but by something quieter and more durable, a genuine understanding of what is true, and the patience to let that truth become visible in its own time. The 6 rusted tractors were the beginning of something because Ethan Walker saw them clearly, and because he saw clearly, he saw them for what they were. Not the end of a story, but the materials from which a story could be built. The most valuable assets in the world have always been the ones that most people have not yet learned how to see.